Hope everybody is well. I want to apologize up front for the dramatics in this introduction. I just got done reading the second to the last chapter in Rene Girard's I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. The chapter is entitled The Twofold Nietzschean Heritage. And this chapter is some of the most important piece of information I've come across from Rene Girard. It spoke to me in such a way that I feel the need to implore you to listen, like, and share it. I almost never ask this from my audience. I don't make any money from this channel or anything else. You also don't have to completely agree with the content of this chapter. You don't have to be a Christian to get the message. You don't have to especially even like Girard. Just please watch it and please share it. I don't agree with all of it. I have a great fondness for both Nietzsche and especially Heidegger, and Girard is very critical in a certain way of them both. And while I've heard versions of his critiques from other sources, I find his criticisms convincing in the context of this chapter and with regards to what's happening right now with the breakdown of the social, political, and cultural discourse in the US and abroad. This is not a political statement for or against any wing of any party. This is not a rejection of the very real energy and injustices that's driving the call for change. This is solely about getting this information in front of those who have the ears and the hearts to hear. Thanks for listening. All right, coming into the conclusion of Rene Girard's I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. We are coming to chapter 14, which to me was the pinnacle of the book. This chapter had a profound effect on me. That's all I can really say about it. I'm going to read it in its entirety. It's entitled The Twofold Nietzschean Heritage, chapter 14. So let's just get started. In our weighing of souls, let us now scrutinize the balance scales of our defects, our faults, our failures. If we gain great advantages from our liberation from scapegoats and sacrificial rituals, this freedom is also the occasion of oppression and countless persecutions. It is a source of peril and the danger of destruction. For centuries, the justice we owe to the concern for victims has freed our energies, increased our potentials. But this concern presents temptation to which we usually succumb, such as colonial conquests, abuses of power, the murderous wars of the 20th century, the pillage of the planet, etc. As I see it, all of the disasters of the last 2 centuries, the most horrible is the systematic destruction, the Jewish people of German National Socialism. Of course, massacres are common in human history, but they are generally conceived in the heat of action and are immediate acts of vengeance, of ferocious spontaneity. When they are premeditated, we usually have little trouble identifying their objectives. Hitler's genocide of the Jews is another matter. Certainly it's part of the long history of anti-Semitic persecutions in Christian Europe, but this evil tradition does not explain everything. Something escapes the usual criteria in this project of annihilation, so meticulously conceived and executed. It didn't serve the German war objectives, but worked to their disservice. Hitler's genocide flagrantly contradicts the thesis argued in the preceding chapters that the Western world, and now effectively the entire planet, is dominated by concern for victims. This contradiction should compel me to change my views or to make it the basis of my entire interpretation of the genocide. The second solution is the good one, I believe. The spiritual goal of Hitler's ideology was to root out of Germany, then all of Europe, that calling that the Christian tradition places upon all of us, the concern for victims. For evident tactical reasons, Nazism at war attempted to conceal the genocide. I think that if it had not won out, it would have announced it publicly in order to show that Nazism had ended the concern for victims as the supposedly irrevocable sense of our history. But to suppose, as I do, that the Nazis clearly found in the concern for victims the dominant value of our world, isn't this to overestimate their moral and spiritual insight? I believe not. They found support in the thinker who discovered the anthropological key to Christianity, its vocation of concern for victims. I refer, of course, to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the first philosopher to understand that the collective violence of myths and rituals, everything that he named Dionysus, is of the same type as the violence of the Passion. The difference between them is not in the facts, which are the same in both cases, but in their interpretation. The anthropologists investigating primitive societies were too positivist, too confident in the evidence of facts by themselves to comprehend the distinction between facts and their interpretation, how they are represented. In our days, the deconstructionists reversed the positivist era. For them, only interpretation exists. They want to be more Nietzschean than Nietzsche. Instead of getting rid of problems of interpretation, they get rid of facts. In certain unedited writings, just before his final breakdown, Nietzsche escapes the twin errors of the positivists and the nihilists, and he discovers the truth that I only repeat after him, the truth that dominates this book. In the Dionysian Passion and in the Passion of Jesus, there is the same collective violence, but the interpretation is different. Quote from The Will to Power, Dionysus versus the crucified. There you have the antithesis. It is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom. It is a difference in the meaning of it. Life itself, its eternal fruitfulness and reoccurrence, creates torment, destruction, the will to annihilation. In the other case, suffering, the crucified as the innocent one, counts as an objection to this life, as a formula to its condemnation. End quote. Between Dionysus and Jesus, there, quote, is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom, end quote. In other words, the accounts of the Passion recount the same kind of drama as the myths, but the meaning is different. While Dionysus approves and organizes the lynching of the single victim, Jesus and the Gospels disapprove. This is exactly what I have said and keep on saying. Myths are based on unanimous persecution. Judaism and Christianity destroy this unanimity in order to defend the victims unjustly condemned and to condemn the executioners unjustly legitimated. As incredible as it may seem, no one made this claim but fundamental discovery before Nietzsche. No one, not even a Christian. So on this particular point, we must give Nietzsche his just due. But beyond this point, sad to say, the philosopher becomes delirious. Rather than recognizing the reversal of the mythic scheme as an indisputable truth that only Judaism and Christianity proclaim, Nietzsche does all he can to discredit the Christian awareness that this type of victim is innocent. He sees perfectly well that one is dealing with the same violence in both cases. Quote, there is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom, end quote, but he doesn't see or want to see the injustice of the violence. He doesn't see or want to admit that the unanimity always prevailing in the myths has to be based on mimetic contagion, which possesses the participations and which they don't recognize, whereas the Gospels recognize and denounce violent contagion, as do the story of Joseph and the other great biblical texts. Nietzsche, to discredit the Jewish Christian revelation, tries to show that its commitment to the side of victims stems from a paltry, miserable resentment. Observing that the earliest Christians belonged primarily to the lower classes, he accuses them of sympathizing with victims so as to satisfy their resentment of the pagan aristocrats. That is the famous, quote-unquote, slave morality. So this is how Nietzsche understands the genealogy of Christianity. He opposes, so he believes, the crowd mentality, but he does not recognize his Dionysian stance as the supreme expression of the mob in its most brutal and its most stupid tendencies. Christianity does not yield to ulterior motives of resentment in its concern to rehabilitate victims. It is not seduced by a contaminated charity of resentment. What it does is to rectify the illusion of myths. It exposes the lie of the satanic accusation. Since Nietzsche is blind to mimetic rivalry and its contagion, he doesn't see that the gospel stance towards victims does not come from prejudice in favor of the weak against the strong, but is heroic resistance to violent contagion. Indeed, the gospels embody the discernment of a small minority that dares to oppose the monstrous mimetic contagion of a Dionysian lynching. Nietzsche had to trick himself to avoid clearly seeing this, to escape the consequences of his own discovery and persist in a desperate negation of the biblical truth of the victim. Nietzsche resorts to an evasion so gross, so unworthy of his best thinking, that his mind could not hold out against it. For it is not by accident, in my view, that the explicit discovery of what Dionysus and the crucified have in common and what separates them occurs so shortly before his final breakdown. Nietzsche's devotees try to empty his insanity of all meaning. We can understand perfectly why. The nonsense of madness plays a protective role in their thought, just as madness itself functions for Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the philosopher, was unable to sit back comfortably in the monstrosities into which the need to minimize his discovery was driving him, and so he took refuge in madness. Christian truth has been making an unrelenting historical advance in our world. Paradoxically, it goes hand in hand with the apparent decline of Christianity. The more Christianity besieges our world, in the sense that it has besieged Nietzsche before his collapse, the more difficult it becomes to escape it by means of innocuous painkillers and tranquilizers such as the quote-unquote humanistic compromises of our dear old positivist predecessors. To elude his own discovery and to defend mythological violence, Nietzsche is obliged to justify human sacrifice, and he doesn't hesitate to do so, resorting to horrifying arguments. He raises the stakes even on the worst social Darwinism. He suggests that to avoid degenerating, societies must get rid of humans who are waste, who hinder, and who weigh them down. Quote, through Christianity, the individual was made so important, so absolute, that he could no longer be sacrificed. But the species endures only through human sacrifice. Genuine charity demands sacrifice for the good of the species. It is hard. It is full of self-overcoming, because it needs human sacrifice. In this pseudo-humanness called Christianity wants it established that no one should be sacrificed. End quote. Weak and ill as he was, Nietzsche never misses an occasion to flagellate our modern concern for the weak and the ill. A true Don Quixote of death, he condemned every measure in favor of the disinherited. In attacking the concern for victims, he denounced the cause of what he took to be the precocious aging of our civilization, the acceleration of our decadence. But this thesis doesn't even deserve to be refuted. Not only has the Western world not aged rapidly, but it seems to have extraordinary longevity due to renewal and perpetual enchantment of its leadership and institutions. The gospel defense of victims is certainly more humane than Nietzsche's thought, but we should not see it in a distortion of some hard truth. It is Christianity that holds on the truth against Nietzschean madness. By insanely condemning the real greatness of our world, not only did Nietzsche destroy himself, but he suggested the terrible destruction that was later done by National Socialism. The Nazis perceived acutely that the grotesque genealogy of Nietzsche would not be enough to vanquish the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Nazis could not wait for the superior human, Nietzsche's overman, to emerge through peaceful historical events. After their conquest of power, they disposed of resources much superior to those of an unhappy philosopher gone mad. To bury the modern concern for victims under millions and millions of corpses, there you have the National Socialist way of being Nietzschean. But some will say, quote, this interpretation would have horrified poor Nietzsche, end quote. Probably yes. Nietzsche shared with many intellectuals of his time and our own a passion for irresponsible rhetoric in the attempt to get one up on opponents. But philosophers, for their misfortune, are not the only people in the world. Genuinely mad and frantic people are all around them and do them the worst turn of all. They take them at their word. Since the Second World War, a whole new intellectual wave has emerged, hostile to Nazism, but more nihilistic than ever a tributary of Nietzsche. It has accumulated mountains of clever but false arguments to acquit its favorite thinker of any responsibility in the National Socialist catastrophe. But still, Nietzsche is the author of the only text capable of clarifying the Nazi horror. If there is a spiritual essence to the movement, Nietzsche is the one who expresses it. Intellectuals of the post-war period cheerfully conjured away the texts I have just quoted. They felt they were in some way authorized by the real successor of Nietzsche, the semi-official interpreter of his thought in the eyes of the everlasting avant-garde, Martin Heidegger. Since before the war, this profound thinker had cast a prudent prohibition over the Nietzschean version of philosophical neo-paganism. He excommunicated Nietzsche's reflection on Dionysus and the crucified, minimizing it, dismissing it, not without cunning, as a simple mimetic rivalry between Nietzsche and quote-unquote Jewish monotheism. Heidegger prohibited the study of these texts without ever disavowing their content. To identify and condemn the inhumanity of what was happening around him was not his strong point, as everyone knows, but his authority has not suffered. During the second half of the 20th century, it remained so great that even until recently, no one dared transgress Heidegger's censorship of the religious problematic that Nietzsche articulated. In spite of its victims without number, Hitler's murderous enterprise ended in failure. It has had a twofold effect. It has accelerated the concern for victims, but it has also demoralized it. Hitlerism avenges its failure by making the concern for victims hysterical, turning it into a kind of caricature. Yet in a world where relativism has seemingly defeated religion and every quote-unquote value that is religious in origin, the concern for victims is more alive than ever. The proud optimists of the 18th and 19th centuries thought they alone were responsible for scientific and technological progress, but a dark pessimism took over the second half of the 20th century. Although understandable, this reaction is as excessive as the arrogance preceding it. We live in a world, as I have pointed out, that constantly reproaches its own violence, and it does this systematically and ritualistically. We are always prepared to translate all our conflicts, even those that don't lend themselves at all to it, into the language of innocent victims. The debate over abortion, for example, whether we are or for against it, we always have to choose our side in the interests of the real victims. Who deserves our sympathy more? The mothers who sacrificed themselves for their children, or the children sacrificed to contemporary pleasure-seeking and self-fulfillment? There you have the question. The nihilism of the extreme left are just as partial to Nietzsche as the nihilisms of the extreme right, but they carefully refrain from reviving the real Nietzschean enterprise, which was to demolish our modern concern for victims. Since the failure of Nazism, no deconstructionist or demystifier has attacked that value. And yet in Nietzsche's eyes, the destiny of his thought was at stake in the deconstruction, in that demystification. Since the concern for victims becomes widespread only in the modern world, we might think that it would marginalize us in relation to the past, but this is not so. It is the concern for victims that marginalizes the past. We hear repeated in every way that we no longer have an absolute, but the inability of Nietzsche and Hitler to demolish the concern for victims, and then later the embarrassed silence of the latter-day Nietzscheans, show for sure that this concern is not relative. It is our absolute. No one has achieved success in making the concern for victims outdated, and this is because it's the only thing in our world that is not the creation of current fashion, although fashions often rise from it. The rise of quote-unquote victim power coincides not at all by accident with the arrival of the first planetary culture. To designate a permanent, unchangeable dimension of human existence, the existentialist philosophers spoke of care or concern. This is the usage I have in mind as I take up this term. I connect it with the modern to underlie the paradox of a value whose recent historical arrival in no way prevents it from asserting itself as the immutable and eternal. There were those who told us not long ago that human life existed in an absolute void of meaning. True enough, the old absolutes have collapsed. Humanism, rationalism, revolution, science itself. And yet even today, this absolute void does not prevail. There is the concern for victims, and it is that value, for better or for worse, that dominates the total planetary culture we live in. The world becoming one culture is the fruit of this concern and not the reverse. In all the areas of activity, economic, scientific, artistic, and even religious. It is the concern for victims that determines what is most important. This new stage of culture has come about due neither to scientific progress, nor to the market economy, nor to the history of metaphysics. What was enduring in the now defunct ideologies was this concern, still clothed in philosophical irrelevancies. In our day, everything has opened up, and the concern for victims appears in broad daylight, in all its purity and impurity. We can see, but only with the advantage of hindsight, that for centuries it has directed the evolution of our world behind the scenes. If the concern for victims has fully appeared, it is because all the great expressions of modern thought are exhausted and discredited. After all the ideological collapses, our intellectuals believed they could settle down into the easy life of a nihilism without obligations or sanctions. But our nihilism is a pseudo-nihilism. To believe in it as real, we have to try to take the concern for victims as self-evident, a feeling so universal and innate that it should not be identified as a value. To the contrary, it is really an obvious exception to our emptiness of value. The wilderness certainly surrounds it, but this is true in all the worlds in which an absolute is dominant. What only the great insight of a Nietzsche could formally perceive, now even a child can perceive. The current process of spiritual demagoguery and the rhetorical overkill has transformed the concern for victims into a totalitarian command and a permanent inquisition. The media themselves notice this and make fun of quote-unquote victimology, which doesn't keep them from exploiting it. The fact that our world has become solidly anti-Christian, at least among its elites, does not prevent the concern for victims from flourishing, just the opposite. The majestic inauguration of the quote-unquote post-Christian era is a joke. We are living through a caricatural ultra-Christianity that tries to escape from the Judeo-Christian orbit by radicalizing the concern for victims in an anti-Christian manner. Belief systems based on illusory transcendence are in process of disintegrating throughout the world under the impact of Christian revelation. The disintegration entails the retreat of religion almost everywhere, and this includes, paradoxically, the retreat of Christianity itself, because sacrificial vestiges from the past have contaminated it for such a long time that it remains vulnerable to the attacks of numerous enemies. The influence of Nietzsche is very much present in our world. Many intellectuals, when they turn to the Bible or to the New Testament, claim to smell there, with a disgust borrowed, of course, from Nietzsche, that what they call des relents de bouc émissaire, the odor of the scapegoat. They find this smell, quote-unquote, nauseating, and I suppose this is the memory of the original he-goat. These fine bloodhounds never exercise this exquisite acuteness of their sense of smell when they turn to Dionysus and Oedipus. No one ever detects in the myths the stench of corpses badly buried. The myths are never the objects of the last suspicion. Since the Renaissance, paganism has enjoyed among our intellectuals a reputation for transparency, sanity, and health that nothing can shake. Paganism is favorably perceived as always opposed to everything quote-unquote unhealthy that Judaism and Christianity impose. Up to and including Nazism, Judaism was the preferential victim of this scapegoat system. Christianity came only in second place. Since the Holocaust, however, it is no longer possible to blame Jews. The intellectuals and other cultural elites have promoted Christianity to the role of number one scapegoat. Everyone goes into ecstasy over the airy, wholesome, athletic character of Greek civilization, as against the supposedly closed, suspicious, dull, and repressive atmosphere of the Jewish and Christian world. This is the ABCs of the universities, as well as the link between the Nietzscheism of National Socialism and the Nietzscheism of Heidegger and his followers. Both share this deep hostility to our religious traditions. If our world were really to escape the influence of Christianity, it would have to renounce the concern for victims. Nietzsche and Nazism understood this well. They hoped to relativize Christianity, expose it as a religion like all the others, just a little worse. As such, it could be replaced either by atheism or by a quite new religion, completely foreign to the biblical legacy. Heidegger had not abandoned all hope for a complete extinction of Christian influence, and they knew start at zero, which would begin a new mimetic cycle. This is the sense, I think, of the most celebrated line in Heidegger's Last Testament interview, published in Der Spiegel after his death, quote, "Only a God can save us," end quote. The attempt by Nietzsche and Hitler to make humankind forget the concern for victims has ended in a failure that seems definitive, at least for the moment. But it is not Christianity that profits from the victory of the concern for victims in our world. It is rather what I think what must be called the other totalitarianism, the most cunning and malicious of the two, the one with the greatest future by all evidence. At present, it does not oppose Judeo-Christian aspirations, but claims them as its own and questions the concern for victims on the part of Christians, not without a certain semblance of reason at the level of concrete action, given the deficiencies of historical Christianity. The other totalitarianism does not openly oppose Christianity, but outflanks it on its left wing. All through the 20th century, the most powerful mimetic force was never Nazism and related ideologies, all those that openly opposed the concern for victims and that readily acknowledged its Judeo-Christian origin. The most powerful anti-Christian movement is the one that takes over and radicalizes the concern for victims in order to paganize it. The powers and principalities want to be revolutionary now, and they reproach Christianity for not defending victims with enough ardor. In Christian history, they see nothing but persecutions, acts of oppression, inquisitions. This other totalitarianism presents itself as the liberator of humanity. In trying to usurp the place of Christ, the power imitates him in the way a mimetic rival imitates his model in order to defeat him. They denounce the Christian concern for victims as hypocritical and pale imitation of the authentic crusade against oppression and persecution for which they would carry the banner themselves. In the symbolic language of the New Testament, we would say that in our world, Satan, trying to make a new start and gain new triumphs, borrows the language of victims. Satan imitates Christ better and pretends to surpass him. This imitation by the usurper has long been present in the Christianized world, but it has increased enormously in our time. The New Testament evokes this process in the language of the Antichrist. To understand this title, we should de-dramatize it, for it expresses something banal and prosaic. The Antichrist boasts of bringing to human beings the peace and tolerance that Christianity promised, but has failed to deliver. Actually, what the radicalization of contemporary victimology produces is a return to all sorts of pagan practices. Abortion, euthanasia, sexual undifferentiation, Roman circus games galore, but without real victims. Neo-paganism would like to turn the Ten Commandments and all of Judeo-Christian morality into some alleged intolerable violence. And indeed, its primary objective is their complete abolition. Faithful observance of the moral law is perceived as complicity with the forces of persecution that are essentially religious. Since the Christian denominations have become only tardily aware of their failings in charity, their connivance with established political orders in the past and present world that are always sacrificial, they are particularly vulnerable to the ongoing blackmail of contemporary neo-paganism. Neo-paganism locates happiness in the unlimited satisfaction of desires, which means the suppression of all prohibitions. This idea acquires a semblance of credulity in the limited domain of consumer goods, whose prodigious multiplication, thanks to technological progress, weakens certain mimetic rivalries. The weakening of mimetic rivalries confers an appearance of plausibility, but only that, on the stance that turns the moral law into an instrument of repression and persecution. Thanks for listening.